The federal government's first home buyer scheme is designed to help first home buyers buy a home. And while stamp duty has always been considered an unnecessary tax, New South Wales Labor leader Christopher Minns recently put forward a policy that should he win the next election, he will exempt first home buyers from paying stamp duty on homes under $800,000. But ANU's Professor of Economics Ben Phillips says it will lower spending capability, claiming that the policy could well be regressive as most first home buyers are mid to high income households. And joining us to discuss in great detail why the move is wrong is Professor Phillips, who's also going to be a regular contributor to The Informer. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, Michael.
Now, why is this move regressive, and is or isn't Minns on a winner with this?
Look, there's a couple of things with it, Michael. So firstly, stamp duty, there's obviously some economists are not a big fan of the tax, but overall it's a very progressive tax. So higher income households are the ones who tend to pay the largest share of it. So removing it does mean that we have to find tax from somewhere else, likely to be a much less progressive source. And in addition to that, it also provides a large amount of tax revenue for the New South Wales government, as it does for all the state governments around the country. And if you remove that, it does mean that there's less money for services. So either have to find tax elsewhere or they have to cut spending somewhere else. And unfortunately, that will mean most spending in aggregate tends to go to lower and middle income families. So it will be the lower and middle income families who are worse off, and middle and high income families who will be better off because they will be not paying the tax that they previously were paying. And as much as we get concerned about first-home buyers, and we probably should do, on average, they tend to be middle to high-income earners rather than low-income households. So they'll do quite well out of this, whereas the households who will do the worst out of it will be those who don't receive the benefits or the services that governments provide from that revenue.
Will this lower the price substantially of new homes on the market, or will it just increase it up because of people will pay what they can afford rather than the value?
Look, I think we often find with these sort of sugar hit policies, that's the at least temporary removal of stamp duty or the increases in first home buyer grants. They do tend to have a bit of an impact, perhaps more so than what you might expect. They're often not huge amounts of money. So it may well provide a little bit of a boost at that sort of lower end of the market. I think most of it's directed at the homes under $800,000, which in New South Wales, in Sydney at least, would be probably units or outer suburban properties. And obviously in regional New South Wales, it's a bit of a different story. The prices are a lot lower there. So yes, it could be inflationary for house prices. So that's one thing to be a little bit concerned about. These programs often can be inflationary. We've seen that before with first home buyer grants and similar story with, say, reductions in stamp duty.
Is there an example from somewhere around the world that you're aware of that has had substantial or successful housing reform that has actually benefited the market?
Look, unfortunately, at least in Australia, I don't think we've really seen a lot of really good policy in terms of housing. It's mostly been these sugar hit approaches, which has been first home buyer grants or reducing taxes to some extent. And I don't think we've really seen that that's been hugely beneficial. What it tends to do is it brings demand forward and perhaps increases prices in the short term. And then you have a bit of a slump once, say, the first home buyer grant is reduced or stamp duty returns back to its previous level. So I don't think in Australia anyway, which is probably where I've probably focused most of my attentions with regard to housing, I can't think of too many really good housing policies. We've occasionally increased public housing, and that's been a good thing. I think the Rudd government increased it by about 20,000 dwellings. That sounds like a lot, but you've got I think it's about 3 million rented dwellings in Australia. So it's really very much at the edges, and we've cut public housing substantially as a share of housing over the past 20, 30 years. So we've got a lot of extra work to do in that regard, and we're a long way from really improving affordability in Australia with regards to housing.
The supply and demand rule, which is present in nearly all economic things, every time we increase demand by getting more people into the market, does that mean price is going to go up? So how do we offset that?
Yeah, so certainly I think in housing in Australia and really right around the world, I don't think it's just particular to just Australia. We've seen, in England, lots of European countries, New Zealand, we've seen a similar story of house prices increasing. So we shouldn't get too caught up on it just being based around some Australian policy or something particular to just Australia. But certainly, we've seen a lot of policies that do tend to inflate demand, and that tends to inflate prices. To some extent, we could probably do more on the supply side, although I'm a little bit sceptical that that has quite as much impact as what some people might like to think. I'd like to see improvements on the type of housing that we build. So that does come back to, say, planning rules. So, say, in my hometown here of Canberra, I know in many also capital cities of Australia, there's a lot of limitations around what you can build. Or institutions like, say, the Grattan Institute, they talk a lot about the missing middle. So that means things like, say, a suburb or two away from the CBD. At the moment, in a lot of Australian capital cities, you can just build a single detached housing dwelling. So that's a very inefficient way of building so close to all the services of, say, the capital cities. Ideally, we'd be able to build a lot more, say, in terms of terrace houses or townhouses, or even more units than what we currently build. Having said that, we have had a pretty strong increase in unit building in Australia in recent years. So we could do a lot better in terms of the type of building, and that would improve affordability, I think, to some extent, and improve the type of housing, the type of housing options that Australian individuals and households would have, which you currently don't have. At the moment, it tends to be, if you're a first home buyer and you want to, if you don't want a unit, you'd have to go outside, way out to the fringes of capital cities. And there's all sorts of troubles with, with providing linked up services and public transport to that sort of distances, and schools and the like. So we can do a lot better with housing, particularly on the housing supply side.
We saw a big change during COVID with the decentralisation, a lot of tree change and seed change, and we saw regional and rural prices, because of that supply demand, actually increase. How much are we building our built environment with a centralisation of trying to live as close to our jobs as possible? How much are we actually creating this housing problem that we're experiencing?
Yeah, look, the COVID period was a very unusual period. I'm not sure I'm that keen to read an enormous amount into that. I'm not sure it's going to mean permanent changes. I could be wrong on that. So I'm not entirely convinced that what we saw during COVID is what we're going to be seeing into the next 5 years or 10 years. But I do think we need to have a more flexible approach with, say, zoning in Australia, and the way government treats housing, and the way we think about housing in Australia. We still too much in Australia, I think, have this idea of the single detached dwelling, which we tend to want to build in Australia. I think ideally we would have say, closer to government services, closer to, say, schools, closer to employment. We'd have a lot more housing options than what we currently do, and I think we're really missing out in that area. And it's probably an area that we could relatively easily make changes, and we're not going down that path enough at this point.
Now, the rental market obviously plays into it. Is the great Australian dream of buying a home so tangible to people because the option isn't as appealing? The rental market, we're finally starting to see build to rent starting to become a small segment of the market, which is big overseas. How much can we help the housing market by improving the rental conditions for tenants?
Yeah, so a real problem, I think, in Australia is we do tend to have mum and dad investors who completely dominate the market. There has been quite a lot of talk, as you point out, around build to rent, where sort of larger investors, institutional investors, say, build a large unit block, and they rent out either all or some share of that building. The mum and dad investor approach we have in Australia, the regulations around it probably aren't as tight as they could be. So you often find, say, people living in accommodation that perhaps isn't as suitable as it could be. Repairs are often done in a very ad hoc sort of manner. And, obviously Australians would want to be living in better accommodation than what they sometimes are in the rental market. Perhaps it's a little bit too stacked towards the investor, and not enough towards the tenant of the house. So that's one of the reasons why we're so keen on buying your own house. I think it's probably partly just a historical thing in Australia. But we could certainly do better, I think, with rental laws. That's certainly an area of weakness, I think, in Australia.
Now, some of the tax incentives as well, Professor, when they talk about, we saw Bill Shorten lose an election, the unlosable election, when he talked about tinkering with negative gearing. If we take away the tax incentives, will we reduce the available rental stock because people simply won't buy them?
Yeah, it's a really tough one to answer. I think there's a lot of people with very strong views on this one. But there's actually not a lot of really good quality research on this one either. So it's very hard to know. I think last time we removed negative gearing was back in, I think, 1987 or around there. I think Paul Keating did it briefly. I don't think there was any particularly major impact with regards to rents at the time or the rental stock, but it was over such a small period of time that I don't think you can really read too much into it. No doubt, look, people do respond to incentives to some extent, and I think if you were to remove negative gearing, I think you would find there would be less of an incentive for people to invest in housing. There'd be fewer mum and dad investors, for example, and that would have some sort of impact on the rental market. Would it change the world? I'm not sure that it would, but it's likely to have some impact. How much? I don't really know, and I don't think anyone really knows that. The research is there's some research out there, but it's fairly flimsy research, I think.
All right, well, that's why we have you, Professor, to guide us through this. So, Professor Ben Phillips from ANU, we look forward to speaking to you again in a couple of weeks.
My pleasure. Thank you, Michael.